Atheist Nomads episode 403, The Doctrine of Salvation.
The podcast you're about to listen to includes cursing and talking about hoo-haws. Please be advised.
Welcome to another episode of Atheist Nomads. I am Dustin, and it's just going to be me tonight. So we're going to have a Dustin off the degree, got some news, and then I'm going to call it feedback. So let's go ahead and jump on in. The Doctrine of Salvation is a topic that, I know I covered it in episode 350, telling my story, because it was a critical part of me losing my faith and leaving Christianity. Because if you don't believe that salvation is a thing that makes any sense, then I was a ministerial candidate and a seminary student. If I didn't believe in salvation, then what would I be doing trying to convert people? Like, the point of evangelism is to convert people, and the point of being a pastor is to help save their souls. And even though Adventists don't actually believe in separate souls, but if I didn't believe in that, then it would have been nonsense. And it was only one of the three things that really pulled me out of religion. The other two being creationism, really starting to look like complete bullshit at that point, after I finally started to learn a little bit better stuff about evolutionary theory, and the authority of Scripture being something that was completely unjustifiable outside of the Bible itself. You put those three together, and at least with Adventism, there's nothing left. You just completely trash the whole thing, and so, of course, I left. But the focus right now is the Doctrine of Salvation. There's a couple of angles to look at it from. And, I had it come up in my systematic theology class in my undergrad, and had an entire course on it in grad school at the seminary. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff to cover with it. Gonna try to keep this high level, relatively easy to understand, and I'm sure Lauren, whose throat is bothering her, hence why she's not on microphone, will glare at me if I get too technical in my jargon. The technical term for it is soteriology, which is the study of salvation. I'm going to break it down into effectively two parts of it. There is Jesus' atonement. So how did salvation get attained as a possibility for humans? And then there's the personal, how did you get it part, both of which are pretty crazy. So let's start off with the atonement. The basic premise that most people think of is just God sent Jesus to the earth to be born and live a human life without any sin, and then he was executed by the Romans, and that satisfied the sacrifice requirements for all humans. End of story. Well, not all humans, but just the ones who believe in him or something. That's the other part. So we'll get to that later. And that model it really comes down to it's what's called the satisfaction theory. And yes, I do actually have my Christian Theology second edition by Miller J. Erickson textbook. If you have this book, I'm on page 799 out of more than 1,312 pages. It's a really thick book that I am glad I still have. The satisfaction theory is the idea that the animal sacrifices that Jews were doing in the temple eras were not sufficient to deal with original sin or human sin at all. It was just enough to do a temporary atonement until Jesus' death, where the act of a god or one of the members of the Godhead or God's Son, who may or may not be a god depending on your Christology, would be, his death was the real one that the animal sacrifices were pointing to, and that included taking on all of the sins from those animal sacrifices, plus everybody in the future who takes part in communion and baptism. And that by doing that, that need for blood was solved, and that it wasn't enough, that human sin was bad enough, that human blood or animal blood was not enough to satisfy God's wrath or needs. It had to be divine blood, that it was that big of the rebellion against God was that big of a problem. That version of it is the oldest version of salvation theology. It is the one that fits best with the writings of both the Old and New Testament. And it's the one that is by far the most ancient barbaric version of it. Yes, that would make perfect sense to anybody living in the first century of the Common Era, because sacrifices were a common thing. For the most part, human sacrifices were done, but animal sacrifices were a common occurrence. So everybody understood what sacrifices did. They were to get the favor of a god. And if you believe that you are cursed, you need that god's favor, and you get that god's favor by killing an animal, barbecuing it, and eating it in the god's honor. Which is why the Catholic version of the Eucharist or communion is that the wine does actually become blood, and the crackers do actually become flesh. Because if you aren't taking part in eating the sacrificed object or creature, then you don't get that God's favor. And it really makes sense that would be, that perfectly makes sense from a first century perspective. That's the way humans had done things for thousands of years before that point. And that's how people continued doing things in the Roman Empire for a couple more hundred years. And in other parts of the world, they still are. Okay, a few parts of the world, they still are. So yeah, that totally makes sense. It makes sense that it's the most biblical one because it's the one that fits the mindset of people of that time period. But theologians have had 2,000 years of cultural development and societal development where they've had to rework this. And especially in the modern era with the rise of nationalism and democracy and education and the Protestant Reformation and all of the Protestant schisms, of course, there's been a lot of people wasting their time trying to figure out a different way of looking at the atonement that makes more sense to a modern person. This is all insane because a sacrifice is an insanely barbaric thing. To try to figure out a way to make it seem less gory and bloody is ridiculous because the whole premise is that it was a human or human-divine hybrid sacrifice. So we're going to start off with the Sociean Theory, which is the atonement as an example. This is the God is love version of sacrificial atonement. The basic view is that God loves you so much that he had to show you extra that he loves you by killing his son, just to show you how much he loves you. Now, what's crazy with this is this theory is basically that God has the ability to forgive people of sins. There wasn't a need for death, like no real need for that. He was just showing how much he loved humanity by killing his kid. The God is love version is of that God is an unthinkable monster. I can't think of any better way of describing that other than just an unthinkable monster. All right, so that's the Sociean Theory. Atonement as an example. The next one we have is the moral influence theory, which is the atonement as a demonstration of God's love. This is similar because, again, it is God is love, and God loved us so much that he had to kill his kid to show us that he loved us that much. But it wasn't just to show us that he loves us that much, but it was to show how serious that sin really is. It's that God loves humanity so much that he was willing to kill his son/self to demonstrate that sin's a really bad thing and you need to do better. Which again would make God a complete unthinkable monster. Not as bad as the just atonement as an example, because just try to show how much you love humanity by killing your son's crazy. Showing how much you love humanity by killing your son to show them how serious you are because you love them so much. is also unthinkably monstrous. Like, we're talking the level of monstrosity of a dictator who's got a civil war going on, a rebellion against his rule, shooting his kid in the head, kid who hadn't rebelled against him, just to show that, yep, this is a really serious thing. You all need to stop rebelling. You need to do better. That's insane. The next one is the governmental theory, which again fits with the brutal dictator. It's that sin was a big enough deal that God needed to make sure that it was viewed as a very big deal. And to show that it was a very big deal, he needed to find the most extreme response to it as possible so that nobody would, in their right mind, would ever risk doing it again. And to do the way to do that would either be wipe out all of humanity, or the other option was kill his son/self. But this one has built into it that because of the resurrection, it wasn't really a real cost, but it was enough to satisfy the need for justice to maintain control of the universe and not spark further rebellion, which is nuts. The ransom theory is the last one we have here, which is the atonement as victory over the forces of sin and evil. This one is basically that in the war between good and evil, evil had won control over the earth, so God had to pay a ransom to get humanity back. And the cost of the ransom that he had to pay evil was killing his kid/self. But because his kid/self hadn't done anything wrong, he was able to resurrect him. In all practicality, that's the least insane one, but still really insane. These are all attempts at trying to make salvation make sense in a modern world. And to somebody who believes in it, those can all kind of make sense. I know even deep in my doubts, my senior year of my undergrad, my personal favorite at that time was the governmental theory. That it was the only one that seemed to make sense in that, or it was the only one that seemed rational. The ransom theory, I think I rejected at that time because in the fight, there's no way that God would have to negotiate with the devil to get humans back. The power imbalance there was enough that wasn't necessary. So while that one seems kind of reasonable, I saw some major flaws with that, but the governmental theory seemed terrible, but the best. And, looking back on them now, they're all absolutely terrible. They all paint the picture of God as the most sadistic and sociopathic dictator in history. And that's the best that theologians have been able to come up with in 2,000 years. They managed to upgrade their god from an ancient war god demanding blood sacrifice to a sociopathic dictator. Now, the other side of salvation is who gets salvation and how you get that. And there's several schools of thought on that as well, of course. And the reason why there are several schools of thought is because of the Protestant Reformation and how that happened. The initial view of at least Western Christianity was the Roman Catholic viewpoint. And it was basically the same as the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches, that the church holds the keys to heaven. And so you get salvation through the church by being baptized and going through the rites and rituals and taking part in communion and confessing your sins to your priest and all of that, doing the penance. And by working through the process, you would then, when you die, go to purgatory, where you could work off the rest of the sin, because at least you were baptized. And that covered original sin. So kept you out of hell, but you still have to go through light suffering before you can get into heaven, which of course brought about the indulgences, which was a way for the church to sell get out of purgatory free cards or cut down your time in purgatory cards. And even before the sales of indulgences, the Crusades, a lot of that recruiting effort was to get into heaven and to skip purgatory, or to go on crusade on somebody else's behalf to get them out of purgatory, or maybe even get them out of hell, but usually just to get them out of purgatory. And this was really what sparked the Protestant Reformation, where Luther and Calvin both came up with the ideas of and developed the idea of predestination, where God chooses who's saved and who isn't. And if you are chosen, then you are given faith to believe that you were chosen, and there is nothing you can do to become saved or to lose your salvation. That it is once saved, always saved, but because God chose to save you, which also means that God chooses some people to condemn. That is still the view of some Baptists and Presbyterians, and should be most or all Presbyterians, and should be the view of Lutherans. Then with some of the little bit more later into the 1600s Reformation, there was some free will moves. Free will reform movements that viewed salvation as something that you choose, not God. That because you have faith, you can choose, or as a free agent, you can choose to believe, and by choosing to believe, you become saved, and then you get access to the sacrificial atonement. And then that will bring about sanctification, which will turn you into a better person, which is the opposite of the predestination view, which is God chooses who to give the salvation that was attained from the sacrificial atonement. And those are the main two views out there for Christianity. The big exception that came was with Universalists, most of whom ended up later merging with the Unitarians to become the Unitarian Universalists. Their view is that everybody is saved, that the sacrificial atonement was for atoning all of humanity, and that by atoning all of humanity, it meant all of humanity, that everyone gets it. That's a much nicer view. And even though the Bible doesn't actually talk about hell as a place, it does talk about the wicked, and talks about the wicked in definitely a way suggesting that they don't get salvation. So that was always a liberal Christian view with people who weren't as concerned with what was in the Bible. But then again, none of these views can actually count for everything that's in a book that was written over 1,000 years by dozens of authors, including fraudulent authors, who all had different viewpoints and different ideas. That is the Doctrine of Salvation in a way longer than I meant nutshell. And none of the options are any good. None of them make any sense. It is a big part of why Christianity is bullshit. But if you ever have somebody trying to convert you, feel free to ask them about how they think people get salvation and how they think atonement works. That could be a fun way to distract someone long enough for you to run away. And now we have news. All right, when we talked to Annie Laurie Gaylor a few weeks ago, I think this first story is the big win that she couldn't talk about that was about to be announced. And it's pretty awesome. The Freedom from Religion Foundation sued the Alabama Secretary of State in October on behalf of 4 Alabama citizens who tried to register to vote, but it required signing a religious oath as part of the registration. And at issue was the final words of it, which was, "So help me God," which if you don't believe in a God and you have to sign this registration form to be able to vote, you either have to sign affirming a oath that includes the word "So help me God," or some of them tried striking out those words. But unfortunately, the rules in place made it such that if you altered the form in any way, such as striking that out, that you could not, your registration was invalid. So that wasn't even an option. In response to the lawsuit, the Alabama Secretary of State's office adopted a policy in November actually allowing people to strike out the last four words, and gave guidance to county registrars saying that voters could cross out that language. But that wasn't obvious on the paperwork, so that was still not sufficient, but it was a step in the right direction. They have now completed a settlement with FFRF that will permanently change the form to include, so they've amended the forms on both the online and mail-in form. And the mail-in form includes a checkbox that says, quote, optional. Because of a sincerely held belief, I decline to include the final four words of the oath above. It looks really awkward on the form because the text is really small, like seriously fine print, which makes the checkbox super small. But at least that's something. I'm going to guess that they probably weren't allowed to just agree to drop "So help me God" from the oath, because that's probably in Alabama state law. Good job, FFRF. It's always nice to see wins, especially ones that don't require a judge to force it. So we've all been concerned for a while now that the new 6-3 conservative-dominated Supreme Court would completely gut church-state separation and secularism, and they've almost finished doing that already. In a 5-4 decision, with the majority opinion being unsigned, but with the court's 3 liberals and John Roberts all signing on to the dissent, it's pretty clear who the majority was. The lawsuit was a private citizen in California who wanted to be able to hold Bible studies in his home. This was not allowed and is not allowed under California's COVID-19 restrictions, which limits gatherings in private residences to no more than 3 households. And this guy wanted to be able to have more than 3 households present for Bible studies or prayer or whatever. The lower courts all ruled against the plaintiff, but the U.S. Supreme Court decided, quote, government regulations are not neutral and generally applicable whenever they treat any comparable secular activity more favorably than religious exercise. They went on to say, quote, California treats some comparable secular activities more favorable than at-home religious exercises, permitting hair salons, retail stores, personal care services, movie theaters, private suites at sporting events and concerts, and indoor restaurants to bring together more than 3 households at a time. As the dissent points out, that's insane. To call retail business establishments comparable to in-home religious gatherings is absurd. People go through retail stores quickly and not congregating together. Hair salons and personal care services, movie theaters and restaurants are all having to follow strict rules to minimize exposure risk that make it so that it's safe enough to have more than 3 households present at the same time. But a gathering in somebody's living room in their private home will never have enough space for distancing. They have already established what the reasonable limits are for how many people you could cram into those small spaces without horribly unacceptable levels of risk, and cap that at 3 households. Putting 5 households in there, you could be looking at 20 or 30 people in someone's home. That's a relatively small space with really crappy ventilation compared to a commercial building, and the exposure risk is totally different. So what the Supreme Court has effectively done here is completely gutted the Employment Division versus Smith ruling that set the standard as religious objections. People who have religious objections to laws still have to follow the law if they are neutral towards religion and are generally applicable, which means under that ruling, the standard would have been gatherings in households is not intentionally being adverse towards religion, and restricting gatherings in households is generally applicable to all households. So that would be a completely reasonable thing to do. Under Tandon versus Newsom, the new ruling, if you can think of something that is even vaguely similar to what you're doing, where somebody else is allowed to do something that you aren't, but you want to do it for religious reasons, then you can. Conceivably, this means that because police officers can speed, that means the speed limit isn't actually generally applicable. Therefore, if you have to speed to get to church on time, you can. That's the logic here. This is absolutely insane, but this is exactly what we expected would happen, that the standard has changed from the government should be neutral towards religion to the government shouldn't be hostile towards religion. And now it appears that the standard is the government must bend over backwards anytime anybody mentions religion. And I just can't wait for when a Muslim or Hindu or pagan brings a case trying to apply this standard. It'll be great to see how the conservative courts rule when that happens, because it's not just going to be conservative Christians. Or, heck, let's just wait until the Satanists do. You know they're the ones that are going to intentionally try to poke at this one. Try and see how much they can get away with to point out how absurd this is. And we need the Satanists to do that, because this is setting dangerous precedent and is not really good for anybody. And while California now can't limit in-home church gatherings, just across our northern border in Edmonton, Alberta, the Alberta Health Services shut down a church until, quote, it can demonstrate the ability to comply with the COVID-19 restrictions. They had asked this church to comply, and the church refused. They asked a little bit more forcefully for them to comply, and they still refused. And then I'm sure they had to say, sorry, but you're closed now. The church still refused to comply with the shutdown, so the pastor was arrested and put in jail, and the police erected a fence around the church. Now, as far as how much they were not complying, the rule was that they could not exceed 15% of their capacity, and they got busted for exceeding that capacity by a lot with no social distancing and no face masks. And they got cited by the Mounties. So after they got shut down and continued violating the rules, the Mounties showed up with a metal fence and made it so you couldn't even get onto the church property. In response to that, about 400 people gathered outside of the fence in protest, mostly not wearing masks and also not following social distancing, because, of course, people protesting the shutting down of a church for not following COVID-19 guidelines wouldn't be following the guidelines either. So they started singing hymns and they had Bible readings, and then some people in attendance started tearing down sections of the fence. As the Mounties rushed in to stop them, some people started chanting, "Leave the fence," and Jesus would not take down the fence. And once they got the people to stop tearing down the fences, a few people in attendance helped the police reinstall them. So it's great to see that Canada is handling this better. And there's a part of me that's kind of glad to see that, yeah, Canada's got its asshole Christians too. Jeff Jansen is the co-founder of Global Fire Ministries International in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and self-identifies as a prophet and is a outspoken supporter of Donald Trump, who has not only in his own church, but as a guest speaker at a church service in Oregon, has talked about his security at his church, where all of the ushers and deacons are armed and are under orders to shoot if anybody tries to interrupt or interfere with the service, which he includes in his instructions to them that they answer to a higher power, as in not to the government. So shoot first and don't ask questions. Well, he went on, speaking at a church service in Oregon, he said, quote, "The church, the ecclesia, the government of God has been so neutered and so turned effeminate, almost homosexual. I'm just telling you straight up, it's ridiculous. Where are the men? Where are the men? Where's the maleness? Where is the, I will defend the children. I will protect the family. In other words, where are the guns? He thinks that churches that aren't arming themselves are effeminate. And that's nuts. Like, if you want to talk about the effeminizing of the church, like, if you want to talk about the feminizing of the church, there is a argument that is a thing that has been happening for many years, that the God is love and the personal friendship with Jesus and the softer image of God was all a creation of, or it was all an attempt to make women feel more comfortable in church. And like, I know I heard about it in the seminary that this was a thing that happened and it has kept women in the church, but men are leaving the church. And even back, in 2007, it was on average at any given church service anywhere in America, there will be at least 2 women for every man in attendance. And obviously, if you're a pastor preaching mostly to women, you will be adjusting your sermon to be better received by the people in your audience. Even if you aren't intentionally doing that, you will respond to what your audience responds to, and you will shape your message to those responses. That's just a natural thing that's going to happen. But that's not what Jansen is talking about. He has a view of Christianity that I don't know where that even comes from. Like, historically, churches have been a place of sanctuary, and you leave your guns at the door or just leave them at home when you come to the church. That, yeah, guns and the church don't go together, but with the modern evangelical right-wing gun orgy of doom that's going on, of course this is what it's going to look like. And of course a right-wing evangelical asshole is going to try to insult more liberal pastors as neutered and almost homosexual, which is not even, like, it doesn't even make sense, but it's like he was trying to add on as many highly gendered insults as he could. What an ass. McKay Henderson and Ike Edwards are a gay couple in Raleigh, North Carolina, who got engaged on Valentine's Day. They're planning their wedding for April of next year, hoping that the pandemic will be over and they'll be able to have a nice big wedding. And they thought they'd found the perfect venue, Highgrove Estate. They got the form to try and secure the reservation, and they noticed there was only a bride and groom section. So Edwards, who is a lawyer and was filling out the form, made a note in the note section that they were a groom and groom. 2 days later, they got a response from the venue that calls itself the Best of Southern Hospitality, saying that they've quote, have not chosen to participate in same-sex weddings at this time, end quote. So the couple went public with this, and the local media picked it up. When the estate was asked about their decision, they said, quote, Highgrove has always welcomed visitors, guests, and employees of all orientations, and we do not discriminate against a people or group. We believe in the sanctity of marriage, as God says in the Bible, and that marriage is between a man and a woman, and we choose to honor him above what the world decides what marriage should be, end quote. In other words, they don't discriminate unless you want to get married. And you can't have it both ways. Either you don't discriminate against anyone, or you do. And clearly they do. Especially after they posted their statement online, they had to take down some of their social media pages. They've had at least one couple withdraw their wedding from their venue over this, and they've also received at least one threat that they passed on to law enforcement. Don't know if it was a death threat or an arson threat, but yeah, just don't be assholes. If they just rented out the venue, they wouldn't have had any of this come up. In Russia, they had a referendum in July for a bunch of amendments to their constitution. Among them was an amendment that reset Putin's term limits so that he can be president for another 2 6-year terms. So for another 12 years. These referendums were passed by 77%, and they've now been signed into law by Putin. And included in the package of amendments was several anti-LGBTQ constitutional amendments, one of which permanently bans marriage equality, putting it in the Russian constitution that marriage is just between a man and a woman, and also permanently barring transgender people from adopting children. Like, this is, of course, these won. They're in Russia. They were backed by Putin. So yeah, of course they won. But putting it in your constitution that gay people can't get married is a super asshole move when it's already not legal. Like, that's just taking it a step further, making it harder to change it. And banning people who are transgender from adopting kids. Russia has an orphan problem. They need everybody they can to be able to adopt children. And I doubt this is a big enough issue to have been worth putting in the Constitution. But he had to score some political points by trampling on gay and trans people. So, fuck you, Putin. And for our final news story, there are 2 villages on the island of Tana in Vanuatu, which is a small island country in the South Pacific, that has revered Prince Philip, who has now died, as the embodiment of one of their gods, or the current incarnation of one of their gods. How that started is actually unknown, but they know that it at least grew when, like, it seems like it was already present even before Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip visited there in the 70s. But they think it probably came from people going to the government offices and seeing his picture next to the Queen's picture, and they created in their myth that, Prince Philip has the the embodiment of one of their gods, and that he's taking care of them and protecting them and will come back to them. There was a couple of times where leaders of this religious group that at one point was several hundred people, now it's just a few dozen, got to actually have some exchanges with him. In 2007, several of them were able to meet Prince Philip in person. They were flown to the UK for the Channel 4 reality TV series called Meet the Natives, and they actually got a meeting with Prince Philip at Windsor Castle, and they gave him gifts and asked him when he would return to Tana. And his reply was, "When it turns warm, I will send a message," which made sense to nobody but seemed to make them happy. So now that he's died, they're now grieving his death and trying to figure out, well, who takes over that role. And it's expected that some of them will probably leave that religious group, and that the ones that stick around will probably switch over to Prince Charles. That godship follows the patrilineal line. So Prince Philip's son is now their god. And then when he dies, Prince William will be their god. And it's really weird for a former colony to have people in a former colony who deify members of the royal family of their former colonial power. It's weird, but this is Earth. Of course there's something that weird happening. All right, we don't have any real feedback. But we did get a episode taken down from YouTube. Now, at this point, YouTube represents a minuscule percentage of our downloads or listens of the podcast, but it still sucks to have an episode get taken down. They are claiming that episode 398, which was titled Mask Burning in Idaho, violated their medical misinformation policy. I appealed it, and they say that they reviewed it carefully, but confirmed that it violated the misinformation policy. Yes, we talked about people who have medical misinformation views in a critical way, not endorsing those views. It's possible I didn't make that clear enough, but that still sucks. I will definitely be more careful with episode titles, and we'll see where this goes. That was the warning. So next, if they take down another video for any reason, it'll be a strike. So yay. So if you want to give us feedback, you can go to atheistnomads.com/contact. You can send us an email at feedback@atheistnomads.com, or you can use the SpeakPipe button on the website. If you want to support the show, you can find out how at atheistnomads.com/donate. And until next week, remember, not all those who wander are lost.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Atheist Nomads. You can find show notes and contact information at atheistnomads.com. Follow us on Twitter at Atheist Nomads, and like us on Facebook at facebook.com/atheistnomads. Please subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcatcher of choice, and while you're there, feel free to leave us a review. Theme music is courtesy of Sturdy Fred. Until next time, this has been the Atheist Nomads.